Salang Tunnel Disaster, Afghanistan. On November 3rd, 1982, two Soviet military convoys entered the Salang Tunnel in the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan from opposite ends, simultaneously, despite standing protocols that restricted the tunnel to one-way traffic at a time. The Salang Tunnel, built by the Soviets in the 1960s at an altitude of nearly 11,000 feet, was 2.7 kilometers long, roughly 5 meters wide, and had no meaningful ventilation system. It was the only viable road connection between the Soviet border and Kabul, making it the single most critical supply artery of the entire Soviet-Afghan war. When the two convoys met near the middle of the tunnel, they could not pass. The resulting jam packed hundreds of military vehicles, fuel trucks, and troop buses into a sealed underground space, with engines idling and no way out. Somewhere in the confusion, a fuel tanker ruptured and ignited. The fire spread through the jam in both directions. Soviet troops at the northern entrance, hearing the explosion, sealed the exit behind them, believing the blast was a Mujahideen attack, rather than an accident cutting off the escape of everyone still inside. Ventilation had been malfunctioning for days before the incident. Carbon monoxide from hundreds of idling engines filled the tunnel as the fire burned. People died from asphyxiation and fire simultaneously in a sealed underground space with no way out. The Soviet government suppressed all information about the disaster, immediately classifying it as a military matter and issuing internal figures of 176 dead. Western diplomatic sources, Afghan refugees who witnessed the aftermath, and subsequent investigations placed the death toll between 700 and 3,000, with the wide range reflecting how thoroughly the Soviets controlled access to the site and the information. The tunnel was a critical military asset and reopened within days. No memorial was erected. No official accounting was ever published during the Soviet era. The Salang Tunnel has killed people in similar incidents in 2010 and 2022 each time, because the same structural deficiencies, inadequate ventilation, and a single-bore design with no escape route remain unremitted. Carrollton, bus crash, Kentucky. On May 14, 1988, a church youth group from the First Assembly of God Church in Radcliffe, Kentucky, was returning home from a day at Kings Island Amusement Park in Ohio, traveling on Interstate 71 in a former school bus, carrying 67 people, most of them children and teenagers between the ages of 10 and 17. Shortly before 11:00 at night, a 1987 Toyota pickup truck traveling in the Warong direction on the same interstate highway struck the bus head-on at high speed. The impact ruptured the bus's unprotected fuel tank, which ignited almost immediately. Fire swept through the interior of the bus within seconds, fed by the flammable foam seat cushions and the limited number of usable exits. The rear emergency exit was partially obstructed. In the darkness and chaos, children and adults trapped in the burning interior could not reach the front door quickly enough. 27 people died, 24 of them children and teenagers. 34 more were injured, several with severe burns and permanent disabilities. The driver of the pickup truck, 34-year-old Larry Mahoney, had a blood alcohol level of 0.24% at the time of the crash, more than twice the legal limit in Kentucky at the time. He had been driving southbound in the northbound lanes for several miles before the impact. He walked away from the crash. He was convicted of 27 counts of second-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 16 years in prison, of which he served approximately 9.5 years before being released in 1999. He has never spoken publicly about the crash. The Carrollton collision remains the deadliest drunk driving accident in American history, a record it still holds today. In its aftermath, the NTSB issued comprehensive recommendations on bus safety that led to mandatory crash-resistant fuel tanks, padded seatbacks, and improved emergency exit standards across the American school and charter bus fleet. Several family members of victims became national leaders of Mothers Against Drunk Driving and helped lower the legal blood alcohol threshold for drunk driving across multiple U.S. states. Chualar bus crash, California. On September 17, 1963, a flatbed farm labor bus carrying 32 Bracero workers, Mexican nationals employed under the U.S. Mexico Bracero program, was crossing a Southern Pacific Railroad track near the farming town of Chualar in Monterey County, California, when a freight train traveling at approximately 60 miles per hour struck the vehicle directly. The bus was pulverized. All 32 passengers aboard the bus were killed instantly. The The death toll made it the deadliest bus crash in American history at the time, and the single deadliest highway rail grade crossing accident in U.S. history, a record it still holds. The men who died had been transported from a labor camp to the fields earlier that morning and were being returned at the end of the working day. The bus was a converted flatbed truck with minimal passenger protection and the standard transportation provided to brushero workers at the time, who had no meaningful ability to refuse the conditions under which they were transported or housed. The incident occurred at a crossing that had a stop sign and a railroad warning sign, but no automatic gates, lights, or signals because such infrastructure was not legally required at rural grade crossings of that era. The driver of the bus, Guadalupe Gonzalez, was also killed. Investigations afterward found that he had likely been unable to hear the approaching train over the noise of the truck's engine. The Chualar crash generated significant public attention, partly because a Life magazine photographer arrived at the scene and produced images of the wreckage that were published nationally. The disaster became a catalyst in the early Chicano civil rights movement and contributed directly to the congressional pressure that ended the Bruchero program in 1964, an outcome the victims' advocates argued was directly connected to the dehumanizing conditions that had allowed 32 men to be transported on a flatbed truck with no meaningful protection. Cali, Colombia, tanker explosion. On August 7, 1956, 8 Colombian Army trucks transporting 42 tons of dynamite were parked overnight in the center of the city of Cali, Colombia, adjacent to civilian neighborhoods and within a few hundred meters of a hotel housing military officers. The dynamite was being transported to a construction site, and the convoy had stopped for the night. Shortly after midnight, an accidental ignition in one of the trucks detonated the entire load. The explosion was one of the largest accidental non-nuclear blasts ever recorded in an urban area, demolishing buildings across a radius of more than a kilometer, shattering windows for miles, and creating a crater 20 meters deep at the center. More than 200 people were killed, most of them civilians asleep in their homes in the surrounding blocks. 4,000 were injured, and approximately 10,000 were left homeless. The hotel housing the military officers was completely destroyed. Few of them survived. While this was a vehicle carrying explosives rather than a conventional traffic collision, it remains one of the deadliest single-road vehicle disasters in history, and the circumstances that caused it, an army convoy, parking overnight with 42 tons of dynamite in a densely populated city center without any security perimeter or public warning, were entirely a consequence of how military logistics treated civilian risks at the time. The blast destroyed 7 city blocks completely and left thousands without shelter in the days that followed. The Colombian government declared a national state of emergency. The generals responsible for the convoy's routing were court-martialed, though the broader question of why a military convoy transporting that volume of explosive material was allowed to transit a major city center and park there overnight was never publicly answered. Interstate 75 fog, Pileup, Kentucky, on May 11, 1988. Dense fog on Interstate 75 near Bowling Green, Kentucky, reduced visibility to near zero in a matter of minutes. As a cold fog bank moved in from the Barren River Reservoir, a localized phenomenon that produced an abrupt wall of fog with no gradual warning for approaching drivers. In the space of a few minutes, a chain reaction series of crashes developed involving more than 50 vehicles, including multiple tractor trailers. Some witnesses described watching semi-trucks driving into the pileup at 55 miles per hour, their drivers unable to see any indication of what lay ahead until they were already inside the wreckage. The pileup stretched for approximately half a mile. 10 people died and dozens were injured. The disaster occurred 4 days before the Carrollton bus crash, making it part of a devastating 2-week period for road safety in Kentucky that prompted state legislators to convene emergency hearings on highway safety. The NTSB investigation into the Interstate 75 crash specifically recommended the installation of fog detection systems and variable message signs that could warn drivers of reduced visibility ahead before they encountered it. Recommendations that took years to implement, but eventually became standard on American interstate highways in regions with known fog hazard. The specific phenomenon that caused the crash cold fog, forming rapidly above a reservoir and then drifting onto the adjacent highway, was a known seasonal hazard along that stretch of Interstate 75 that had caused accidents in previous years. The investigation found no warning signs had been posted and no monitoring system was in place to detect fog formation in the reservoir zone and alert approaching traffic before they entered it. Yuba City Bus Disaster, California. On May 21st, 1976, a chartered bus carrying 58 farm laborers, mostly Mexican nationals working in the orchards of the Sacramento Valley, plunged off a levee road near Yuba City, California, and fell into an irrigation canal. The bus submerged almost completely in water. Of the 58 people aboard, 29 drowned before rescue teams could reach them. The accident occurred in the early morning hours when the bus traveling at the end of a night shift went off the road at a curve near the levee's edge. Investigators concluded the driver had likely fallen asleep. The canal was approximately 4 feet deep, but enough to trap passengers through the windows and doors of a submerged bus. The Yuba City disaster was the deadliest bus crash in California history, and at the time, the second deadliest in U.S. history. It drew renewed attention to the conditions under which migrant farm laborers were being transported in California, 13 years after the Chualar crash had generated the same conversation. Both accidents involved the same category of worker, the same informal transportation arrangements, and the same absence of the occupant protection standards that would have been legally required for a standard passenger vehicle. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration subsequently issued revised standards for the structural integrity of bus bodies in rollover and plunge scenarios. The transport company operating the bus was found to have been unlicensed for passenger service at the time of the crash. Several of its vehicles had been flagged in previous inspections, but remained in operation. The company ceased operations within weeks of the crash, before any regulatory enforcement action was completed. No criminal charges were filed against the company's owners. Guadalajara Bus Crash, Mexico. On July 18, 1999, an overloaded passenger bus traveling on a mountain highway in the state of Jalisco, Mexico, lost control on a steep downhill section and plunged into a ravine. The bus was carrying an estimated 52 passengers on a route with a legal capacity significantly lower than that figure. The impact at the base of the ravine killed 42 people. Investigations found that the bus had known mechanical deficiencies, that the driver had significantly exceeded the route's permitted passenger load, and that the relevant authorities responsible for roadworthiness inspections had last documented the vehicle's status months before the crash. The Guadalajara disaster was one of dozens of major bus crashes in Mexico during the 1990s, attributable to the same cluster of factors: overcrowding on routes with poor regulatory oversight, vehicles operating beyond their service life without adequate maintenance, and mountain highways with grades that exceeded the safe braking capacity of aging bus fleets. The Mexican Transport Ministry responded with a series of regulatory announcements in the months following the crash, though enforcement capacity in rural states remained limited throughout the following decade. The crash occurred on a section of highway where 4 similar accidents had been documented in the previous 3 years, all involving buses losing control on the same downhill gradient. None of the previous accidents had produced a formal hazard classifications for the road section or a mandatory speed restriction for heavy vehicles. The gradient remained unmodified at the time of the 1999 crash. Firozabad train and road disaster, India. On August 20th, 1995, the Purushottam Express train struck the Kalindi Express, which had stopped on the tracks after hitting a cow at a station near Firozabad in Uttar Pradesh, India, killing more than 300 people in one of India's deadliest train collisions. The Firozabad disaster, while primarily a rail accident, is included here because of the scale of the road traffic that contributed to the death toll in the immediate aftermath. Hundreds of spectators and bystanders had approached the wreckage by road and on foot before official rescue teams arrived, and the resulting road congestion on the single access route to the crash site delayed ambulances and fire services by more than an hour, during which time survivors who might have been extracted and treated died of their injuries in the wreckage. The disaster became one of the clearest examples in Indian transport safety literature of how road access to catastrophic incidents, or the lack of it, could multiply a death toll independently of the initial cause. The single unpaved access road to the Firozabad crash site became impassable for ambulances within 40 minutes of the collision as hundreds of private vehicles converge. The first hospital-capable ambulance to reach the site arrived 97 minutes after the initial impact. Subsequent Indian Railway disaster protocols introduced dedicated emergency vehicle lanes and civilian access restrictions as standard requirements for any major crash response. Azam, Warsak, road accident, Pakistan. On February 6, 2023, a passenger bus traveling on a rural highway near the town of Azam, Warsak in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, province Pakistan, plunged into a ravine after the driver lost control on a section of mountain road with no safety barriers. The bus was carrying workers from a local construction site. 41 people were killed and 17 were injured. Pakistan records hundreds of major road accidents annually on its mountain highway network, where road surfaces deteriorate rapidly under monsoon conditions, safety barriers are absent on most secondary routes, and vehicles routinely carry more passengers than their structural design permits. The Azam Warsak crash received international coverage because of its death toll, but was representative of a category of accident that occurs in Pakistan at a rate of roughly once every few weeks at comparable scale, overloaded vehicles on unmaintained mountain roads, carrying workers who have no alternative, operated by drivers with minimal regulatory oversight, and no physical barrier between the road's edge and the drop below. Pakistan's National Highway Authority reported 5,900 fatalities from road accidents in the first 6 months of 2022 alone, a figure that placed Pakistan among the highest road fatality rates per vehicle in the world. A 2019 World Bank assessment of Pakistan's secondary highway network found that fewer than 12% of mountain road sections with grades above 8% were equipped with roadside barriers of any kind. The Azam Warsak crash was different from the others in this video, only in how many people died at once. The conditions that produced it were present on hundreds of roads across the same province on the same day. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments below.